Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name's Jennifer. I'm gardening here in Connecticut. I'm in Zone 6. And throughout the growing season, I like to do pretty regular garden tours just to really kind of document the progress of my plants as they grow throughout the season. I think that it's really helpful for me to look back and just to see just how my plants grow and change. And I know it can be a really helpful thing when I'm feeling discouraged about how there hasn't been a lot of change. But then I look back at my garden tour from a couple weeks ago and see, wow, there actually has been a bigger change than I realized. So that's one of the reasons why I really like to do these garden tours, and I think it's a lot of fun to share my garden with you throughout the growing season. So a couple days ago, we did pretty much a full garden tour where I showed you all my in-ground gardens and raised beds. But that video was running a little bit long, so we didn't get to basically my little container garden here on my deck. So today we're going to do a little mini tour. I'm just going to show you my container garden, and we'll take a look at all the plants that I have growing in pots here on my deck. So before we go into the details and the specific plants, I figured I would just give you guys a little bit of an overview of how my overall garden deck looks. Now I'm sure you can see that I don't have the neatest and most well-maintained container garden. I honestly don't consider myself that skilled of a container gardener. I usually have a lot more success with my main gardens. But you know, I've been learning how to grow in containers, and I've definitely had more success in recent years than I have in the past. So I definitely think that it's something that's worth doing. Now, when you're starting a container garden, there's a couple things you're going to keep in mind that are a little bit different from gardening in the ground. One is that you are definitely going to need to feed your plants more regularly. Now, I like to use a slow release fertilizer when I first plant my plants in their containers, and that feeds them for quite a while so that I don't have to fertilize as often. But you're still going to want to just keep an eye on your plants and containers for signs of deficiency, because their resources are really limited. You know, their roots can only go in however much space their pot gives them. They can't stretch out and find more nutrients the way plants in the ground can if they're starting to run out. So it's really important to keep them fed. It's really important to keep them watered, especially during the hot summer months. I mean, there's times throughout the summer when I'll have to water my containers every day. I mean, honestly, if we get a really hot spell with no rain, sometimes I may even have to water twice a day. So another thing to keep in mind when it comes to growing plants in containers is choosing the right plants that actually will be successful for you in their containers. Now, when it comes to growing plants in containers, it can be helpful to look for plants that have a more compact growth habit. For example, something like growing determinate tomatoes instead of indeterminate tomatoes, because they tend to take up less space. That is definitely not a hard and fast rule, and it's not a rule that I really follow, because as you'll see when I show you all the specific varieties that I have, the majority of tomatoes that I have on my deck are indeterminates, and I think actually maybe all the tomatoes I have on my deck are indeterminates, so they do need quite a bit of space. I have found overall that smaller fruiting tomatoes, like cherry tomatoes, tend to be more successful for me than larger fruiting tomatoes, but that doesn't mean I don't grow larger fruiting tomatoes on my deck. I do have a handful of those plants here as well. One plant that I have found to be an exceptional container plant are peppers. Now, peppers, that's probably the one plant where I have more success growing them in pots than I do in the ground. For some reason, peppers just seem to do better for me in pots. I'm not really sure why. If you watch the garden tour that I posted a few days ago, and then compare it to this garden tour, you can see I showed you in that garden tour some peppers that I have growing down in the garden, and today I'll show you the peppers on my deck. And you'll see that for the most part, the peppers on my deck look larger and healthier and just generally more successful than the peppers I have growing in the ground, even though many of them are actually the same varieties. So peppers are definitely a great plant to grow in containers. Now, as we go through and look at the specific plants, you'll see that the majority of plants that I have on my deck here are either peppers or tomatoes. Honestly, if this was my only garden, if I had maybe an apartment and the only area I had to garden was a patio, I would probably be growing a bigger variety up here. But since peppers and tomatoes tend to be fairly successful for me in pots, and I have in-ground space to grow other things, that's what I tend to do. But honestly, there's so many other things you can grow in pots too. And I do have a few other things. So let's just take a look at the plants that we have growing on this deck. Now, you'll notice that a lot of the pots that I have are not anything fancy. These are just reused nursery pots for the most part. And I have a few that I've actually purchased as well. So here is a red Corno de Toro pepper plant. Now again, if you compare this to the Corno de Toro pepper plants that I showed in my in-ground garden tour, you'll see that this pepper plant looks larger and healthier, so I think that it's overall going to be more successful. So here I have a little clementine plant. This is actually a plant that my son started from seed maybe 5 years ago now. He was eating a clementine and came across a seed, which you know is pretty rare for clementines, decided to plant it. So we know that this is not going to fruit for years, and when it does fruit, it will most likely be different than the original clementine that the seed came from, but it's still a fun experiment. It's really interesting to me because over the years, I've tried growing a variety of citrus plants in my house, and here in Connecticut, citrus plants cannot survive the winter. So we have to grow them in pots and then bring them inside for the winter. So I've tried growing a variety of fancy citrus plants that I've purchased at various nurseries, and they've had varying degrees of success, but ultimately they've all died, with the exception of that clementine plant, which, I mean, honestly, looks pretty healthy. So I'm not sure what to expect. It may never fruit, or if it does fruit, it may not be something that we actually enjoy eating, but it's still kind of fun just to try it and just see how it does. So I know it's going to be hard to distinguish individual plants in this jungle I have here, but back in this pot, you can see I have 2 pepper plants growing together. These are shishito peppers. You can see they're getting quite a bit of fruit on them. So peppers actually don't mind being a little bit crowded. So this is a fairly large pot, but together I'm okay growing 2 peppers in it. And I also just plopped a little basil plant in here too as a little companion. Now moving down, I've got, you can see I have some weeding to do, some weeds in there. But this is a Maxwell cherry tomato plant. For the most part, the tomatoes that I grow on my deck are cherry tomatoes because I find that they're a little more successful. But this one is just starting to get some little tomatoes, so that's exciting. And then next to it is another cherry tomato plant. This is a Berries Crazy Cherry. And this one, I'm not sure if it has tomatoes or not yet, but it certainly has a lot of flowers. This flower cluster here is actually from the Berries Crazy Cherry. It's just kind of invading the space of the Maxwell cherry there. So actually, recently, I've been having more success growing basil in pots on my deck than in the ground. So I tried to grow a variety of basil this year. This one is a spicy globe, or a spicy bush basil, which this one's doing really well. Now I've been harvesting from this. I've been harvesting this for a little bit. I'm going to try to find a good example to show you. If you take a look at this stem here, you can see right in the middle of these 2 leaf clusters, there's a little nub there. So when you harvest basil, what you want to do is you want to find the center stem here, and when you want to pinch it back. See here where there's these little leaves growing out on either side of the stem. You want to pinch it back to here. And what's going to happen is each of these 2 little leaf clusters is going to basically turn into a main stem. That will help make a nice bushy basil plant rather than a tall spindly one. That will lead to a healthier plant and more overall harvest. So I've done that a few times with this basil, and you can see it's looking pretty good. So down here is a little mammoth basil. That one's really just getting started. It's really tiny right now, but it should catch up. So I've got a creeping rosemary and a traditional rosemary. Both of these will have to come in my house over the winter because they're not winter hardy in my zone, which is why I grow them in pots. Then here I've got purple ball basil. So I've been harvesting this the same way. You can see it's starting to fill out nicely. I did grow these in pots on my deck last year, and they got big and bushy and filled out the whole pot, so I'm really looking forward to that. So I really like to grow a variety of different basils. I find that basil is a really versatile herb. It's a very summery herb to me. And it goes with so many of the summer plants that we grow in so many summer dishes. I like to have a variety because, partly because I just like variety. It's more fun to me to have a variety of different colors and textures. I think it just makes for a more beautiful garden. But also, they have slightly different flavors and they behave slightly differently. So sometimes depending on growing conditions, one variety may be more successful than another. And honestly, I just like this one because it's purple and it has these cute little tiny leaves. I really enjoy this basil. Now next to the cherry tomatoes, I have what was labeled as a horizon tomato plant. I'm wondering if I mislabeled it though because the tomato shape doesn't look right. This looks more like kind of a crazy heirloom slicer, where the horizon is usually sort of a smaller rounded tomato. But we'll see what happens when that actually ripens. Either way, that tomato plant's looking nice and healthy. Now moving on down here, there's quite a few more pepper plants, so let's go in for a closer look. So this one here is a second red corno de toro. I don't see any signs of fruit on this one, but the plant looks nice and healthy, so I'm thinking we should get fruit at some point. And you can see it's starting to get some little buds there. Back here is a sugar rush peach pepper. There's a couple little fruits on the plant here, not ripe yet. Now, I've never grown this pepper before. It's supposed to be very spicy. Not sure exactly what I'm going to do with it, but it seemed interesting, so I'm giving it a try. Now, for the most part in the past, I've grown a variety of sweet peppers and also some jalapenos. And occasionally I'll grow some cayenne peppers just to dry and use for herbalism, or just to make a little bit of seasoning with. But I am experimenting this year with growing a bigger variety of peppers, and I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to do with those Sugar Rush peach peppers, because I think on their own they'll be a little bit, well, they'll definitely be too spicy for me. I think on their own they'll probably also be too spicy for my husband. So if you have suggestions, maybe a hot sauce recipe or some other suggestion that you've used those types of peppers in, I would love to hear it. Specifically the Sugar Rush peach. Sounds like it has a really interesting flavor, but I'm definitely going to need to tame the spiciness somehow if we're going to actually be able to enjoy it. So back here, this one's looking a little bit smaller. This is a coral bell pepper, which is supposed to be an orange pepper. I've never grown it before, but it looked really delicious. So the plant is small but looks healthy, so we'll keep an eye on that and see how it does. In this pot here, you can see I have some bush beans. This actually originally had potatoes in it, which I experimented by growing inside my house over the winter. I have not harvested them yet, so there's probably some potatoes in there. And then I added in some bush beans. These, I believe, are a yellow bush bean, so I'm looking forward to getting some harvest from those. This pepper here is a lunchbox mix. Now these come in red, orange, and yellow, and rather than buying them individually, I bought the mix, so I should get some of each. And you can see there's one pepper and some flowers on this plant right now. Now when I bought that pack of the lunchbox pepper mix seeds, they were listed as an open pollinated variety. So what that means is that as long as I prevent cross-pollination, I can save seeds from those peppers and know that the pepper plants that those seeds produce will be the same pepper plant that I have growing there. Now, if cross-pollination happens, they could be any kind of mix. I could end up with something really good or maybe something not quite as good. So my plan is, I'm not sure how many of those lunchbox pepper plants I have growing, 2 or 3 maybe. I'm going to try to save some seeds from each of them, and hopefully they'll be different colors. And eventually what I would like is to have my own seeds of each individual color. Since they're open pollinated, I can do that and know that each color will come true. So we're going to give that a try. So what I'm going to do, the pepper that's on the plant now, I didn't do anything to prevent cross-pollination, so that could be cross-pollinated with any other pepper that I have growing up here. So those little flowers that you saw, I'm going to come out and take a little gauze baggie, and I'm going to cover one of those with a gauze baggie, just those little like favor bags that you can find at the craft store or at a Walmart or someplace like that. And I'm just going to just pull the little strings and enclose that flower before it opens. Then I'll make sure to pollinate it myself self-pollinate it using the same flower. That way I know that it won't be cross-pollinated and that any seeds I save from that pepper will be true. So that way if I end up with my lunchbox mixed peppers having different colors, I'll have isolated my own seeds from each color of pepper. So that's the plan. I don't know how well that's going to work, but we're going to give it a try and see how it goes as the season goes on. So here I've got a nice tall looking pepper plant. This is Corno de Toro yellow. So I wanted to make sure that I had both the red and the yellow variety of this pepper. I'm trying growing them as an alternative to bell peppers this year because I haven't always been the most successful with bell peppers in the past. So back in this large pot here, I've got 3 early jalapeno pepper plants. I know they're a little hard to see with all their neighbors just kind of invading their space. But you can see these plants are starting to get some pretty nice looking peppers. Now in my experience, early jalapenos don't yield quite as much as some other varieties, and they're definitely less spicy, but they do yield early, as the name suggests, and I like to grow them for variety. Now, in front of those jalapenos, I've got a couple basil plants here. This is kind of a traditional sweet basil, like a Genovese basil, and this is a mammoth or lettuce leaf basil. You can see the leaves are larger, and when the leaves come out, they're a little bit crinkly. So I'm growing both of these for variety. You can see that I've been harvesting both of these similarly to how I showed you on the spicy basil too. Now I've got another pot here, which, as I said with the previous one, was originally potatoes. The potato plant is kind of dying back now, and it's getting taken over by bush beans. Now, yes, bush beans is what they're supposed to be. As you can see, they are trying their best to turn into climbing pole beans, though. So as I mentioned when I was talking about that first pot there, I had some potatoes in my house that had started to sprout, just regular potatoes that we were planning to eat. So I decided to throw them in some pots over the winter and see what happened. Now, they were not incredibly successful looking in my house. The plants didn't get huge, but they did grow, and I'm guessing there's most likely some potatoes in here under the surface. So at some point I'm going to try digging those out and we'll see what happened in there. But just to make the most of the space, I did plant some bush beans around the potatoes. Now back in this big pot here, I have 3 cherry tomatoes that I'm just kind of letting sprawl, and you can see these plants do not look like the healthiest. We have actually been getting quite a bit of rain lately, and some of the tomatoes have been kind of succumbing to disease a little bit, which I think is the case with these 3 cherries here. So I am going to fertilize these, and I'm going to pull off the yellowed foliage, and we're going to hope for the best here. Now, I don't remember for sure which varieties I have. Let me see. I know I have tags on some of them. So I have a Berries Crazy Cherry here. You can see it looks like a lot of the flowers may not be setting. I'm not sure if that's weather related or just because the plant isn't that healthy. Here I have the Spoon Tomato, which, let me find some tomatoes to show you. They're tiny little things. This is basically a currant tomato, which means it's a tiny cherry tomato. It's supposed to produce hundreds of them, but they're supposed to be extremely small. This one over here is missing its tag, so that'll be a mystery that will be solved whenever the fruit is ready to harvest. Okay, so next to that pot of mixed cherry tomatoes, I have a large tomato plant here. This is an Azoichka, which this one seems to be doing really well. The plant is tall and healthy. You can see it's starting to get some tomatoes in here. There's several. Going to be a while till they're actually ripe, but it is producing well, and it's got more flowers, so it should continue producing for a while. You can see I did not keep on top of pruning this. I didn't get all the suckers off, and you can see that the plant is kind of going crazy because of that, but it should still be delicious. Now, as some friends for this tomato plant, I put a nasturtium and a little basil plant in the pot with it. Because this pot is really only big enough for one tomato plant, I did want to make the most use of space though, so I put some other smaller companion plants in with it. Now here I have a little mixed basil pot. We've got purple ball basil. We've got, I thought the only purple basil I planted was purple ball basil, but this one looks a little larger, so we'll keep an eye on this and see. This is mammoth basil or lettuce leaf basil and spicy bush basil. Put those there. So my hope with growing some of these potted basils here on the deck is that I will be able to take those inside my house in the winter and continue to have basil harvest all winter. Now, historically, I've not been that successful with growing potted basil inside my house. It does really well for me outside on my deck in the summer. Something about the conditions of my house, it just doesn't like as much. So we're going to do the best we can. And what I do like to do as we get closer to the end of the basil season, or really even as the season goes on, as I harvest basil, I harvest extra when I can, and then I will chop it up and put it in ice cube trays and mix it with either olive oil or chicken broth, depending on how I plan to use it, and freeze it. I find that that works a lot better. It retains a lot more flavor than if you dried the basil. So I like to preserve it that way, and that way I can kind of throw it into whatever I'm making with it. If I'm making some sort of olive oil based sauce, I'll use the basil that's frozen in olive oil. If I'm putting it in a soup or something like that, I'll use the basil that's frozen in chicken broth. I find that that works really well, and that is my preferred way to preserve herbs like basil that really, in my opinion, they just don't dry that well. So we've got a couple more peppers here. This one in back is Alesia pepper. I am not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's supposed to be, I think, fairly similar to a bell pepper, but pointed on the end. It's supposed to be very sweet and very delicious and red, so I'm excited for that one. And then here in the front here, this plant looks really nice as well. This is a King of the North bell pepper. As I said, I haven't been all that successful with bell peppers in the past, so we're going to see how it does. And hopefully this will be the year that that changes. Now moving on over here. In this pot, I have 2 pepper plants. They're both Corbaci peppers. Looks like we don't really have peppers yet, but we are getting flowers. And again, they have a little basil friend in the pot with them. So it has been my experience that pepper plants can handle crowding a lot better than tomato plants. So I regularly will put multiple pepper plants in a pot together. They grow together, and they really seem to do well that way for me. So we're doing that again this year with some of my larger pots, and hopefully that will maximize the amount of pepper yield we can get. Now over here, I have another tomato plant. This is actually a green tomato called Evergreen. I got these seeds in a grab bag at the end of last season from Emma Gardner. I have never grown green tomatoes before. And here, while we're here, there's a little sucker. I'm just going to pinch off this plant. So I've never grown green tomatoes before, and honestly, Something about them just has never really appealed to me. So this will be the year. Getting that seed in the grab bag kind of pushed me into trying it. So this will be the year I try it, and maybe I will be pleasantly surprised. We'll see. But there's a couple tomatoes there. Just got to wait for those to ripen. And then I'll let you know what the verdict is on this green tomato. Now, as you can see, the pots on my deck really kind of turn into a jungle, and they really all have to get along with each other because they don't have a choice. But over here in these pots here, I have 3 pots, and each one has a Craig's Grande jalapeno. This is a new jalapeno variety to me. So we've got at least 1 good-sized pepper so far. So as I mentioned, I've never grown the Craig's Grande jalapeno before. It was highly recommended though. Normally what I grow every year is a mix of the early jalapeno and jalafuego, which is a little bit larger and a little bit spicier than the early jalapeno. So I find that growing those two gives me a good blend of jalapenos. This year, I forgot to order seeds for my jalafuego because I thought that I already had seeds left from last year, but it turned out I did not. I had already placed an order from that company, so I didn't want to place another order and have to pay shipping. I still had to place an order with Baker Creek, who carried the Craig's Grande jalapeno, so I decided to try those as a replacement instead. So we're going to see how they do. If you've grown the Craig's Grande jalapeno before, let me know how you liked it. Let me know how the spice level compares to other jalapenos that you've grown, and also what your favorite thing to do with it is, because, as I said, that's a new one to me, so I'm excited to try it. Now over here is another large pot with 3 different cherry tomatoes in it. You can see they are getting a little bit of disease from all the rain that we've had lately. But in this pot here, I've got Sun Gold, I've got Red Centiflor, and I've got, I believe the third one is Rosella. So that will be a fun variety of colors. So I really like having a big variety of cherry tomato colors. The Red Centiflor is a new variety to me. That one is red. Sun Gold is not new to me. That's a tried and true favorite for me. And those are kind of a golden orange color. Those are really delicious. Rosella is also new to me, and those are sort of a smoky, deep purple color. So I'm really excited to try those. So I think having those colors growing together will be really beautiful. We'll give a nice variety of colors and a nice variety of flavors. So I can't wait until it's cherry tomato season. Feels like things are a little bit behind this year, which I think honestly they are. And even talking to some local farmers in my area, they agree that in Connecticut things are a little bit behind. We had kind of a cool spring. Early summer was cool. It took a long time for things to really warm up, and so a lot of those heat-loving plants are really just getting going now. So I am hoping that we'll be able to hold off tomato disease long enough to still get a really good harvest from our tomatoes this year. So we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll hope for the best, and we'll see how the tomato season goes. So here is a Corno de Toro again. This one is another yellow, so I'm excited about that. It's got a little basil companion. And over here is a whole pot of holy basil, which is also called Tulsi. This is a delicious medicinal herb for tea, so I'm trying to grow a lot of that this year. So my final pepper plant on the deck is over here. This is a habanada pepper, which is supposed to be similar to a habanero, but without the heat. And it seemed really interesting, so I'm excited to try that. I don't see any fruit on this yet, but it's got lots of little flowers starting, so hopefully pretty soon that will give us some fruit. So that's all the plants that I am planning to grow on my deck for the entirety of their lives. I do have some other plants growing on my deck that have other purposes that they're ultimately destined for, so I'll just show you guys those real quick. So here I have a box of comfrey plants. These are going to go under my apple trees. We're going to be making some apple tree guilds, and I was hoping to have gotten to that already, but if you've been following my recent videos, you know I ended up breaking my toe, which has set me behind on a lot of things. I can't really do that kind of project at the moment until my toe is fully healed. So pretty soon, these comfrey plants will find their home under my apple trees. Now this tray of plants here will also be becoming part of the apple tree guild. These are looking a little worse for the wear because these really wanted to get into the ground a while ago. But I've got some clover, I've got white clover here, I've got thyme, I've got yarrow, and I've got chives. So these are all going out with the comfrey, hopefully pretty soon. Honestly, it's probably going to be a couple weeks till I am up to doing that, but we'll definitely get it done before fall. So stay tuned for that if you're interested in that project. Now here, you can see we got a lot of rain last night, so my trays are all filled up. But here I have some plants that are started for my fall garden. These are Roma tomatoes, and these are going to go in a couple places once some of my earlier crops come out. And these are my fall broccolis. These will be replacing my spring broccolis when those come out. Now over here I've got some random plants that I'm not really sure what I'm doing with yet. These are some raspberries that I dug out of my raspberry patch because they were actually encroaching on places they shouldn't be. So I think I'm actually going to experiment and plant these along the edge of my woods and see if they can survive there. Here, and again, you can see filled with water from all the rain last night. But I've got some holy basil seedlings. I've got one purple ball basil. These are actually raspberry agastache, which is a perennial. So these took a while to grow, and I would like these to get a little bigger before they go out to the garden. So those may end up getting planted in the fall. And then a little more holy basil. As you can see, all these plants are kind of not looking their best. They really want to get planted. Here's a tomato plant that was damaged and is actually making a comeback. So we'll let that grow and see what happens. And here is another tomato plant that was damaged and making a comeback. So those may get planted in my garden somewhere to be fall tomatoes. Now over here, I have some tomato suckers that I pulled off my plants that I am busy rooting. And I would like to get a second harvest of tomatoes with these. So rooting tomato suckers is a great way to get a second harvest of tomatoes. You know, most people like to prune those suckers off their plants anyway. So what I do is if I find some that have gone a couple days too long, gotten away from me a little bit, and they're maybe like 6 inches long or so, I'll clip them off and stick them in a jar of water. Or sometimes I'll just stick them directly in a pot of soil and see what happens. And most of the time what will happen is those will grow roots and become an entirely new tomato plant. Now I can plant those in maybe a week or so when they're a little more established, and what will happen is those will be behind all my other tomato plants, and at the time that my other tomato plants are kind of starting to slow down a little bit, those suckers should be ready to start yielding and pick up the slack. So I'm hoping to be able to get a fall harvest of tomatoes that way. It's a little bit easier because you don't have to start from seed. So we're going to keep an eye on those, and hopefully that will really extend our tomato harvest season this year. So thank you so much for joining me on this little mini garden tour of my deck. Now let me know if you watched the full garden tour and this little mini container garden tour. Let me know, would you prefer these to be condensed into a single garden tour, probably about every 2 weeks or so, or do you like it this way, split up, where we have the in-ground gardens and then we have the container gardens? I'd like to know which way you guys prefer to watch so that I can hopefully accommodate. So again, thank you for joining me today. I hope that your gardens are doing well, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.